From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The U.S. and China bring tariffs down and stocks go right up. Welcome to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz in Washington alongside Bloomberg's Michael Shepard. Joe Matthew is off today. After weekend talks in Geneva, the U.S. and China have taken the rates of tariffs charged on each other down to 30% and 10% respectively. We'll have the details with Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall and get analysis from Samm, a professor at Yale, this hour. Plus, we have to cover geopolitics as well. The last living American hostage just released by Hamas from Gaza right as President Trump heads to the Middle East and floats the idea of making a trip to Turkey, where Ukraine and Russia peace talks could happen later on this week. And of course, we have to cover the latest in Congress as well as we get details on what exactly is going to be in this massive spending cut and tax cut package in budget reconciliation. Former House Financial Services Committee Chair Patrick McHenry will join us this hour. But we have to begin with the relief rally underway on those U.S. and China tariff headlines. And Charlie Pellet is keeping track of the movement from New York. Hey, Charlie.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Kailey Leinz. I got you covered with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all pushing higher. And right now we have got the S&P 500 index trading right around, very close to the best level of the session. Stocks are powering a global risk rally on that U.S.-China truce. The S&P up 167 now. That's an advance of almost 3%. The Dow up 1,035 points, higher by 2.5%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 715, now up by 4%. The Russell 2000 Index of small cap shares up 3.4%. And the Bloomberg Mag 7 Index now up by 5.2%. Bottom line here, stocks trading like the Liberation Day shock never happened. 10-year yield 4.44%. The 2-year 3.97%. Spot gold is down 3% now, $32.23 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 2%, $62.22 a barrel. So the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all pushing higher. Techs among the standouts. Apple up 5.6%. Nvidia now up by 5%. And Tesla moving higher by 6.6%. Again, recapping, stocks rally, S&P up by 3%. Balance of Power continues right now. And back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Mike Shepard and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Wall Street clearly liking what it heard from Geneva, Switzerland, and then again from here in Washington as we heard President Trump talking about the progress made between the U.S. and China. Maybe don't call it a deal, Mike Shepard. Maybe just call it a truce for a temporary period of time. It's a 90-day window in which tariffs go from 145% down to 30% in the case of what the U.S. charges on Chinese goods. For China, goes from 125 down to 10. Still, though, higher than it was before this whole thing kicked off.
Higher than it was before President Trump took office, and it's certainly higher than many investors and businesses certainly were hoping for. But nonetheless, they did see some glimmers of hope there, and in particular when it comes to what they were saying about the tariffs over fentanyl. Because if China is able to demonstrate enough progress and reach a deal in some of the other areas, that would bring the floor all the way down to 10%. And that's what we saw negotiated with the United Kingdom just last week.
Yeah, a very good point. It doesn't seem like anyone realistically has a great chance of getting below 10%.
That seems to be the new floor globally. But I guess up for negotiation like everything else with this administration.
Yeah, well, and if we have an understanding of the floor, perhaps we also have an understanding of the ceiling, because everybody said that 145% where we stood before on China wasn't going to go any higher than that. Of course, we did hear from President Trump about this earlier today as he spoke from the White House before leaving on his trip to the Middle East. This is how he characterized the progress made between the world's two largest economies.
In addition, yesterday we achieved a total reset with China after productive talks in Geneva. Both sides now agreed to reduce the tariffs imposed after April 2nd to 10% for 90 days as negotiators continue in the largest structural issues. The relationship is very, very good. I'll speak to President Xi maybe at the end of the week. We have some other things we're doing.
So we want to get more details from the White House now and turn to Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall, who is live from the North Lawn here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Obviously, Tyler, there was mixed expectations going into the talks in Geneva, but the White House clearly is trying to paint this as a success, even if some are characterizing it as capitulation from this administration.
Yeah, hey, Kailey, definitely a positive tone being struck by this administration. You heard President Trump there saying that even he could potentially have a call with the Chinese president by the end of this week. We should say there has not been a confirmation of that or a readout from Beijing's side on that possibility. But it does go to show how both sides here are really trying to take that de-escalation in a bid for a longer and more firm trade deal down the road. In fact, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was on Bloomberg television earlier today, and he said that they have established a mechanism to continue talks, which just reminds us there's still a lot of negotiations to be had.
China was the only country who escalated their tariffs in response to our reciprocal tariff level. So that resulted in an unfortunate escalation. So we now have a mechanism to deal with that. Neither side wants a generalized decoupling. The U.S. is going to do a strategic decoupling.
So Scott Bessent there talking about some of the threads that we could see as we move forward, including decoupling when it comes to strategic industries like pharmaceuticals and chips. There's a few other angles that we're watching here. One, importantly, is what purchase agreements could look like. This administration has said that the Phase 1 China deal could be a template moving forward here. That's why we're going to be watching closely U.S. agricultural imports and what sort of enforcement mechanisms this White House may be weighing as they look to boost those obligations from China. The second, of course, is fentanyl. We heard President Trump earlier today saying that he believes China will make good on its word to crack down on flows coming out of the country. And the last one, of course, is those non-tariff barriers that this White House talks a lot about. President Trump says that he had received a commitment from China, and we did actually hear from them earlier today that they were going to reverse or remove some of their non-tariff countermeasures. It is our understanding that that very likely applies to lifting some of those export controls when it comes to critical minerals that have been applied since April 2nd. Now, Kailey and Mike, of course, we're watching closely here how these negotiations go. The Treasury Secretary did tell Bloomberg Television that that 10% levy is the floor. It's implausible that it's going to go below that.
Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall from the White House. Thank you very much. And now we'll go to New York to our colleague Romaine Bostick for a little bit more on this rally that we are seeing across Wall Street in so many different categories. Romaine, thank you for joining us. Are investors perhaps reading a little bit too much into what was discussed over the weekend between the U.S. and China, given that there is still so much fine print to write and agree on?
To a certain extent, I think there's two sides to this, Mike. I mean, there is the idea that this is still going to be a very long process to get to an actual concrete deal with actual sort of concrete potential benefits for both our country and theirs. But you have to understand, too, this is a market that had really priced in the worst case scenarios. They were pricing in 145% tariffs on China. They were pricing in 30, 40, 50% tariffs on some of the other nations. And now we're at least back to some sort of baseline, at least if you believe what the president has said, as well as what Scott Bessent said earlier today on Bloomberg Television, that there is now a bit of a floor. And it's a floor that, at least in the minds of a lot of traders right now, Mike, they think they can live with. So whether that's a 10% baseline tariff and maybe a little bit something extra on top of that, that at least in the case of China, gets us to 30%. There's a sense that at least some of the bigger companies that are in the S&P 500 and in some of the other major indices, that they can actually weather that, and that maybe that's justification for the rally.
Well, my question, Romaine, is when this rally takes more into account the implications potentially for monetary policy, or not as much easing as was anticipated if tariffs remained high. I would note what we heard, though, from Adriana Kugler, the Fed governor, who suggested, look, this is still likely to result in slower growth and higher inflation even at these levels. Could we see stagflation still either way, just maybe not quite as pronounced?
Yeah, the comments that Kugler made earlier today were, I think, really sort of telling, right? This is a Fed that, of course, has said that it wants to wait until it sees the effect of inflation to do anything. But her speech and the comments that she gave were very blunt. Basically, the idea that what affects the economy isn't always just the hard data. She was getting at the idea that just the fear and the uncertainty does create a bit of stasis in corporate America, which, of course, can have a trickle effect down to the labor market and, of course, to consumer spending. And as a result, that she was being on guard. And those comments really weren't that far out of line with what we've heard from other Fed members as well. So this is a Fed that I think at the minimum, is still going to be on the sidelines, but is certainly sort of guarding for a more downside scenario, definitely a much more of a downside scenario than what we're seeing in the pricing in the market right now, which is an S&P up 3% on the day, if you can believe it, Kailey Leinz.
Yeah, almost 4 full percentage points on the NASDAQ 100. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick live in New York for us. Thank you so much. Of course, all of that being driven by the headlines out of the U.S. and China talks over the weekend. So we want to get more on that now and turn to Samm Sachs, professor of China Studies at Yale University, who is joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Professor Sachs, welcome to Balance of Power. When we consider how different a place we are in now compared to before these talks beginning in Geneva over the weekend, from 145% and 125% respectively down to 30 and 10%. Yes, both sides took tariffs down by an equal amount, but do you actually see this as a truce that is equal, or did China actually kind of come out the winner here?
It's too soon to know. Both sides have essentially agreed that talking is happening, and they couldn't even get that basic point straight between the two of them. We were engaged in this long game of chicken where Trump was insisting that she wanted a deal, and she didn't want to look weak, potentially facing a President Zelensky moment in the White House. So the fact that they have agreed to announce that talks are beginning itself is a stabilizing factor, but it tells us nothing about what the nature of any agreement actually will look like.
Professor Sachs, what is the significance of the two sides actually putting together a joint statement? There is a lot of optics in every trade negotiation, of course, but with China, the optics count even more. What do you make of this after just 2 days of discussions between the two sides?
Both sides want a deal. That's the bottom line. And I think it's coming from a place of political and economic weakness in both countries. What the joint statement says so far doesn't actually tell us anything. By and large, the statements are identical in Chinese and English, with the exception of some word choicing. I think whether or not they can get to a joint public agreement, once we get into the really hard issues, like what would a purchase agreement look like? What does fentanyl cooperation entail? The Chinese side desperately wants the U.S. to lift export controls. I don't see that happening. The U.S. side desperately wants the Chinese to undertake deep reforms in its economy. I don't see that happening. So once we get to the harder part of the negotiation, I think having this kind of joint communique is going to be increasingly difficult and could actually stall out altogether, depending on what happens.
Well, as you talk, Professor, about what the U.S. wants to see in terms of changes really to the structure of the Chinese economy, and this isn't unique to the Trump administration. The Biden administration under Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen talked about this plenty as well. Concern over China's manufacturing overcapacity and the idea that it's flooding the market globally with cheap goods. What incentive does China have to actually change that practice? Can the U.S. really force that?
The incentive is going to have to come from internal sources. And something that often happens is you'll have interlocutors in China will use outside pressure from the U.S. to force changes to the domestic economy that politically wouldn't be possible without an external, U.S. forcing event, but it needs to come from the inside. So one thing we know about the lead of the Chinese delegation right now, the Vice Premier He, he's less of a reformer than the interlocutor for the first round of talks, Liu He. And so this is someone who's a staunch advocate of a state-led economy, not of more market liberalizations. And so I think that's going to be another factor that's going to make these kind of deep reforms more challenging. But we have to remember, Xi Jinping is under tremendous pressure right now in terms of Chinese jobs, Chinese businesses in the private sector. And so this is going to be something that's going to get them to the negotiating table, not necessarily because the U.S. is compelling them to. It has to come from within.
Professor Sachs, one thing that came up this morning during our conversation with Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, was a new baseline, perhaps, for tariffs. And we'll have a listen to this, and I'd like to follow up with a question about it afterward. Let's bring him in.
Are you saying that tariff rates will only go up from here if this really is a floor of 10% on the Chinese side and 30% on the U.S. side?
I'm not saying that they're going to go up, but it would be implausible that they would go below 10.
Professor Sachs, how does this reset the U.S.-China trade relationship when it comes to tariffs, if we're talking now about a baseline that could perhaps go a little bit higher?
You know, we don't really know yet. I think they're just trying to send a signal to consumers, to voters, to U.S. stock markets on the Trump administration side. Today, the stock market rally was a huge political win, and Trump wants to take credit for that. So I think that's what this baseline signaling is really about. But until we get into the nitty gritty, it's unclear. Now, could China just go back to the 10% baseline and be treated the same essentially as the other countries that are all in the process of potentially looking for deals or not? It's possible. But I think the idea is it's going to be impossible to fully recover to before Liberation Day. We're not going to go back to that. And it's a question of how far we're going to go. Is this just going to be strategic sectors, or is this going to be a sort of wholesale trade embargo? And I think we're looking now at a more narrow tailored decoupling. But what that means, again, what is the U.S. side actually going to offer up here is really what we have to watch.
And Professor Sachs, what sort of signal is this sending to other U.S. trading partners that are also locked in their own negotiations with the Trump administration, even as we speak?
I think that, no one wants to have I think no one wants to be like China in this situation. So maybe it opens the door to more deal making. If China was the most intractable, I think we could potentially see a flood of other deals, maybe looking like the US, UK, or Mexico. But China certainly has always been the elephant in the room and will set the tenor for others to come.
Well, but when we consider trading partners in Asia specifically, which the administration has put a lot of emphasis and prioritization on, India, Japan, South Korea, how does that also influence ultimately how reliant the U.S. actually will be on China for trade and for goods going forward?
This gets at the question, what does the Trump administration actually want? Do they want to close the loopholes, for example, that have just squeezed trade and exports to places like India, Vietnam, Mexico? Because what happened is you have manufacturing diversification. No longer can export from China. Let's shift those supply chains to Vietnam, Indonesia, India. But then all of a sudden, those tariffs were just as high. So if the goal here is to reshore U.S. manufacturing and restore America's place in those supply chains, I think we're going to still see significant pressure on some of those other parts of the world. But at the same time, the U.S. is not going to want to alienate its key trading partners at a moment when it wants to sort of bandwagon. It wants Southeast Asian countries, for example, to come on board and be an economic counterweight to China.
All right. Professor Samm Sachs of Yale University, where she is a professor of China studies. Thank you so much for being here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And it was interesting, Mike, to hear the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in his interview on Bloomberg Surveillance earlier, characterizing what the U.S. is trying to do here as being a strategic decoupling from China. The prior administration didn't want to use the decoupling language at all, but I guess this one is looking at it in a targeted way.
In a few areas. And they talked about pharmaceuticals, and they also talked about semiconductors. And that, of course, is an area of key contention. And Professor Sachs even brought that up in passing. And it is crucial to note the differences between the two sides, including with export controls over sales of U.S. ships to China.
Yep, those non-tariff barriers we keep hearing about, or non-tariff mechanisms, or what have you, export controls theoretically fall into that. So we'll continue to follow this story here on Balance of Power. But up next, we have to turn to other geopolitics as well, as President Trump makes tracks to the Middle East and potentially has a visit to Turkey. That could happen. We'll have the details next here on Bloomberg. And make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast on Apple, Spotify, anywhere else you get your podcasts. Plus, listen anytime on Bloomberg.com. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I am Kailey Leinz alongside Mike Shepard here in Washington, where, of course, we've been following a number of stories that broke over the weekend, but perhaps none sent the city quite as abuzz as the reporting from ABC that hit yesterday, that the government and royal family of Qatar, where President Trump is visiting on his trip to the Middle East this weekend, was preparing to offer him, for free, a luxury Boeing 747 jumbo jet for him to effectively use as the new Air Force One. This is something the president himself has confirmed and talked about from the White House earlier today.
I think it's a great gesture from Qatar. I appreciate it very much. I would never be one to turn down that kind of an offer. I think it was a gesture because of the fact that we have helped and continue to. We will continue to. All of those countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and others, we keep them safe. If it wasn't for us, they probably wouldn't exist right now. And I think this was just a gesture of good faith.
And Mike, we should note that the president says this is not a gift to him personally. It's a gift specifically to the U.S. Defense Department. But when we're talking about the size of this gift, this is an airplane that costs hundreds of millions of dollars. There are massive legal and ethical questions around this.
And strategic questions, too. What would the government of Qatar want in return, or perhaps expect in return? Not even so much as a quid pro quo, per se, but if they are offering something, eventually they might want something in return. And the question remains, what is it? Is it perhaps an easing of restrictions on access to NVIDIA chips? Is it something else? Is it just a better understanding with the U.S.? And the president sought to make clear that he would not be using this luxury jumbo jet after he left office, as ABC had reported. But nonetheless, it did raise the question about whether this was some sort of emolument, which is prohibited above a very nominal level to him.
So we want to get into this now because it's a fascinating story, and there's other topics to discuss around it too, and turn to our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with us. Rick, of course, Stonecourt Capital partner and Republican strategist. Jeanne, Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Jeanne, I was struck by the reaction of Laura Loomer, who, of course, is somewhat of a diehard for the president. In fact, in her critique of this gifted airplane, she mentioned that she would take a bullet for President Trump, to use her words. But even she doesn't like the notion of this very expensive gift from a foreign government. And I wonder if you think that backlash may be enough to make this not happen.
It absolutely could be. It's Laura Loomer, very close to the president. It is Ari Fleischer. He's on Fox News all the time. There are other conservative Republicans who have come out and said, no, Mr. President, do not do this. And of course, while you and Mike were talking about this, I'm thinking, what happened to Made in America? We can't have dolls and pencils made overseas, but he can have a plane. I mean, putting aside the real serious consequential security issues, the constitutional issues, the legal questions, what about Made in America, Mr. President? I guess that's gone by the wayside when it comes to his jumbo jet.
Well, Rick, is there anybody in the president's inner circle who might be in a position to actually talk him out of this? He really made it seem like a done deal, and it would be pretty hard to turn it down on his way to Qatar to meet with the leaders there.
Yeah, let me think. Susie Wiles talking him out of a $400 million gift. No, don't think so. Look, it is a Boeing jet. It was made in America. I mean, we got a piece of that, although maybe designed and outfitted in Qatar. This is going to be a story that lasts a while, because even though very generous gift by Qatar, I mean, very inappropriate for the president to say yes, he can't fly on that thing until it's outfitted with all the most state-of-the-art electronics, redundancy in every facet of it, and significant alterations to its ability to defend against an attack. These are all the reasons why the current new Air Force One is slow to get going, because there are a lot of changes. All that's got to be done to this plane before he flies in it for 1 hour. And that is a new charge to the American taxpayer. The reason it's going to the Department of Defense is because they have the budget to actually retrofit it. So, it's going to be a story we're going to be talking about all summer long, because someone's going to say, gee, how much did that cost the American taxpayer to retrofit, in addition to the new one that we're building before the end of the administration?
It's an excellent point, Rick. And obviously, this story is going to be kept in the news, at least for this week, because President Trump is going to be spending time in Qatar this week, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE. He is on board the current Air Force One heading to the Middle East right now. And Rick, I wonder what outcome you really expect from this first big trip abroad of his second administration, not focusing necessarily on geopolitical issues or regional conflict. Instead, we understand he's mostly there to try to secure money, investments into the United States. This just about deal making?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is. I was actually on the president's trip to Saudi Arabia in May of 2017 when, he basically was trying to reopen Saudi Arabia for investment and foreign direct investment into the United States. And that worked for a little while, but the Biden administration kind of chilled that out. So I think this is to retro start that, right? Get it going again. Let's get those Saudi dollars, the UAE, Qatar dollars, get the GCC into investing in the United States. And I'm sure there'll be questions with these folks about price of oil, how much pumping's going on. Nothing is more obsessive to Donald Trump than the price of a gallon of gasoline. And these folks in the Middle East have a lot to do with that. So my guess is the one thing that's probably not going to be a news story, and it'd be interesting if it was, is whether or not he can convince the Saudis to enter into an Abraham Accord, and something he was very proud of in his first term with Israel. But it just seems Israel's not on this agenda this week.
Jeannie, how critical is it for the president to show continued progress when it comes to those investments? He started really on his first full day in office announcing that kind of an economic push from abroad into the U.S. You'll remember that big Softgate AI data center announcement, and from there, it's been off to the races. How much more are we looking for, and how much more will he be able to follow through with all of it?
Yeah, I think the concern of many of us is the question of whether this is about investment in the United States or investment in Donald Trump, his companies, his sons, his family, Steve Witkoff's family. I mean, he is famously not going to Israel this trip. He is going to Qatar. He is going to Saudi Arabia. These are places where just in the last few weeks and months, his sons have talked about deals they have struck in the interest of the Trump family and the Trump business. They have talked about this Gulf agreement. They have talked about this crypto agreement that was made and that they have benefited from. So, yes, I mean, if the focus is on investment in the U.S., that is absolutely something to be welcome. But I think the concern here, just like the concern about the airplane, is this really about the U.S. and what's in the interest of U.S. security? Or is it about Donald Trump and his family and friends? And you see real evidence, if you just look at where they've been traveling and what they've been posting, that a lot of the focus is on the latter, unfortunately.
Rick, I want to return to where you ended your last answer. As you mentioned, Israel perhaps not being as much in focus. And we should point out that today, back in Israeli territory, is the last living American Israeli hostage that was being held by Hamas, Adnan Alexander. This appears to be a release that was essentially negotiated singularly without necessarily Israel being involved. And whether you're looking at this particular instance, knowing there are still remaining hostages in Gaza, whether you look at the kind of truce that has been gotten to by the U.S. and the Houthis, the U.S. talking to Iran, all of it kind of paints a picture of President Trump being, if not at odds, at the very least, not as in alignment with the Netanyahu government as was thought when he came into office. Is he still the best friend Israel's ever had?
I think he's still probably the best friend Israel's ever had, but I'm just not sure Bibi Netanyahu is going to think of him as the best friend he's ever had. You've struck a good chord. Donald Trump's out doing his own deals with the Houthis and with the Hamas, and the reality is you never hear about that beautiful development in Gaza anymore. That was a real lift to Bibi Netanyahu's war plans to be able to clean that out and actually move Palestinians out of there. So much of that early, first month in office when there seemed to be an incredible link between the two countries and the two presidents has seemed to pretty much vanish. Now, there are other priorities, and it doesn't mean that the president has lost his affinity for the prime minister. But the reality of it is that this was a week where you would have thought the president would have ended his Middle East tour in Jerusalem, a big victory lap based on his relationship with the Israeli people and with Bibi Netanyahu, but didn't seem to come to pass.
Jeanne, without about a minute left, we also may see the president take a detour to Turkey for talks on Ukraine. How much pressure is he under to deliver and show some more progress there?
Yeah, he's under a lot of pressure, a lot of it self-imposed, because we're long past his 24, 48-hour window, Mike, for him to get this deal done. But weirdly, over the weekend, he seems to be negotiating with Zelensky on his own. I mean, Putin seems to be out of it. He's saying to Zelensky, just make a deal, just, end the war yourself. Don't wait for Putin. So I think Zelensky has done the right thing, saying he's going to go to Istanbul, invited Putin to come. It doesn't look like Putin will come, and that will open him up to continue to get support militarily, intelligence, and otherwise from the U.S. as Putin continues to be the sort of problem in these negotiations, not Zelensky.
All right, Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis, our political panel on this Monday. Thanks for being here, as always, on Balance of Power. And still ahead, we'll be joined by the former chair of the House Financial Services Committee, Patrick McHenry, as we turn our focus to Congress and the budget reconciliation package. What exactly is going to be in these tax cuts? We'll have the details ahead here on Bloomberg. We're kicking off the week in Washington, which is going to be a very big one for Republicans in the House of Representatives specifically, is tomorrow. About 24 hours from now, actually, two key markups are going to happen in crucial House committees. The Energy and Commerce Committee, which has released a bill that includes what the Congressional Budget Office says is more than $880 billion in cost savings, in part because nearly 14 million people could get kicked off Medicaid rolls in the next decade. Then there's the Ways and Means Committee, which, of course, is charged with outlining the broad tax package, all the tax cuts the president wants, and perhaps trying to find a number that is going to make the SALT caucus happy. According to our reporting here at Bloomberg today, the number they're looking at for married couples in high-tax states like California and New York, $30,000. So you remove the marriage penalty, it's up from $10,000, but it still might not be enough, Mike Shepard, for some of those SALT caucus members who've been pushing for numbers more than double that.
Well, that's right. And Mike Johnson can't afford to lose too many votes, given the margin in the House right now. And everything is riding on this. The big, beautiful bill we've heard the president talk about so much. And there is a lot more than just SALT going into this. We're also looking at some of his campaign priorities, including exempting Social Security income and exempting tip income as well from taxes. So we're going to be looking for a lot, and lawmakers have a lot of angels to stand on the head of a pen here.
Yeah, they do. Keeping in mind, they want to do this in just a handful of legislative days, as the speaker wants to see this thing passed on the floor by Memorial Day. So we want to get into this wider reconciliation process now and turn to someone who was in, of course, the House of Representatives until recently, former Republican congressman from North Carolina and former chair of the House Financial Services Committee, now Bloomberg contributor as well. Patrick McHenry is here with us in Washington. Welcome. So when we consider this SALT issue in particular, knowing that there are a number of moderate members who make or break the House majority who are going to have a very difficult time with this, considering their constituencies, is this actually what is going to make or break an ultimate floor vote?
Absolutely. So the SALT caucus has been hard at work for years on this. The reason why we were able to pass the original Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017 is because we overcame those votes, those Republicans from SALT states, New York being the biggest and the loudest group of Republican legislators here. SALT does not model out as a Senate problem at all. There are no Republican senators from states where the state and local tax is a big issue for ratepayers. New York holds the balance for Republicans, and they're the majority makers in the House of Representatives. They gave us the majority 3 years ago and last year. And so they need to be taken care of. They need to be taken care of in a way that's sufficient for their constituents. They can't go home and say, I raised your taxes. That's not a good message for Republicans anywhere, but most especially in a state like New York. So you have really competent, smart legislators here. The question of whether or not 30,000 is going to be sufficient for them, we're going to see, and we're going to see in a very public way. These are the most public Republicans you see in the House of Representatives. They are loud. Mike Lawler. They know how to get media attention. They know how to draw attention to the issues they care about and draw people in. So we're going to be drawn in, and we're going to be live with them every step of the way.
Based on your experience, what sounds like a level that would get these members over into the yes column?
So this is the difficulty of negotiating on this. More is the number, right? So you say a number and they say more, and eventually we'll find that number. I don't think it's going to be a round number. At the end of the day, it will be something different than what we tend to do in the Congress, which is like a nice round number. So we're gonna see this. I don't think this is a fully baked product coming out of the committee.
Well, and I guess the markup will be revealing. We've heard tell that it's going to go into way late in the night tomorrow, and something we'll have to continue to follow throughout the week. I also want to talk about what's going to get marked up in the Energy and Commerce Committee, though, because, of course, Medicaid was the other massive question. They have, according to the Congressional Budget Office, come up with a package here that is actually going to save more than they were charged with saving, more than the $880 billion. But the cost of doing so is potentially 13.7 million people losing their benefits over the next decade. Senator Josh Hawley, a Republican, says this argument is both morally wrong and politically suicidal. Do you see this as political suicide if it passes?
No, because savings to healthcare programs does not necessarily mean those that benefit from the healthcare program get less of it. It may mean that somebody in the middle has their wonderful profit box that gets gored. And so we see this with payment issues through CMS. This is a very standard challenge with healthcare policy, is that they always go back to a number of people that are directly benefited, and it never is the case. So let's step back. What is the package that House Republicans are proposing here? First, Brett Guthrie is the chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee. He is an expert in healthcare policy. He's worked with their members to dial in the specifics of the policy that they think will have the greatest savings to the taxpayer and the least amount of harm to those that benefit from these healthcare programs, number one. Number two, they're going to reform these programs so you have better delivery and better quality of those that are getting healthcare benefits through Medicaid. So I think some of these things are quite sensible, and I think the shock and awe number of people getting thrown off of the plan, I think it will not end up that way. I think it'll be a much set of sharper outcomes that will be beneficial to the taxpayer and to the public.
Are the work requirements that are being discussed right now even practical? Will people be able to follow through and follow all the steps necessary to continue qualifying if they are put in a position of having to make sure that they verify employment to receive Medicaid benefits?
Traditionally, yes. Those people that are receiving these benefits tend to be experts in how to receive these benefits. So let's step back. On work requirements, Republicans have been for work requirements for our social safety net for generations. This is not a new set of policies. And in fact, this work requirement we put in place for food stamps during the debt ceiling negotiations 2 years ago at this time. That got a 2/3 majority in the House, the Senate, and signed by Joe Biden. Some of these work requirements are not right-wing policy or some ideal set of right-wing policy. Some of them are just very practical things that can be achieved in a bipartisan vote.
Just because you mentioned the debt ceiling, we also should point out on Friday the Treasury Secretary sent a letter to the Speaker that says you need to get that thing raised before the August recess, because at that point is when the Treasury might no longer be able to meet its obligations. Does that time frame make you nervous if the debt ceiling raising mechanism is to be the reconciliation package?
It makes me nervous, but as a congressional leader, it is the welcome sign that there's an end date for the pain and suffering of going through the reconciliation process. We saw this with the Biden administration trying to do 2 reconciliation bills, and it drug on for months and months and months. We have an end date now. And if you want to leave town as a congressional Republican, you better get your stuff together in the month of July, or you're going to be sitting here roasting in the month of August. I think that condenses the timeline. That is a good thing for the safety and health and happiness of the American people.
Chairman, does the need for speed, though, mean perhaps that the president may have to let go of 1 or 2 of the big priorities he outlined during the campaign? And we were just talking about this in the open, exempting Social Security income and tipped income. Does something have to give as the push and shove gets more intense?
I think what you see from this administration, I think what you see from this president, he's going to get his way with congressional Republicans. He didn't make 50 campaign pledges on tax policy. He made 2 or 3. He's going to get those 2 or 3.
Mm-hmm. Something else that he talked about a lot on the campaign trail was being a super pro-crypto president. He wants to make the U.S. the Bitcoin capital of the world. He seemed widely supportive of legislative efforts on the Hill, and yet we saw one of those efforts fail on the Senate floor last week as the stablecoin bill failed to get adequate support, knowing you spent a lot of your time leading the Financial Services Committee on this issue. What does that signal to you, not just about the future of stablecoin legislation, but if you can't do that, what hope is there of getting something on market structure?
Oh, that's right. So this is the easier go of it. A stablecoin is a payment mechanism. We have a payments regulatory regime. We haven't defined what is a payment stablecoin in federal law yet. It is a very simple undertaking for a stablecoin bill. Market structure is a little more complex because we're talking about a new decentralized object and various pieces of technology that do different things, right? Yeah. So it's defining the internet. Well, the internet is many things and many layers to it. It's hard to do that in one bill. So market structure is the thing that is necessary for crypto to flourish here in the United States. The payment stablecoin bill that the Senate has worked on, they marked it up, welcome sign for the Senate Banking Committee, commend Senator Scott for his adept handling of this, and Senator Haggerty and Lummis and Gillibrand, they did a fabulous job. But you have almost all Republicans together on crypto, and you have a remnant of Senate Democratic members. So you have 10 to 15 pro-crypto Democratic senators, and they're fighting against the base of their party, especially the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee, who is a real problem to crypto. Warren, yes. Well, what they understand is that crypto is popular. They want to be for it. They also don't want to get bludgeoned by their fellow Democrats. It has been a very tough set of politics for these Senate Democrats to be pro-crypto. What we'll see, though, this week, maybe even next week, but probably this week, is they'll come to terms with a reasonable set of policies, and they'll have enough cover from their colleagues, Democratic colleagues, that they can do this. I think they need a little political cover, frankly, to come to a reasonable spot, and that's what we got last week.
Chairman, speaking of political cover on crypto, what are you expecting from the White House in its policy blueprint from David Sachs on cryptocurrencies and digital coin? Are you expecting this to really shape things on Capitol Hill?
I think these products are largely baked. We spent 4 years crafting the market structure bill we passed out of the House with a 2/3 majority. I think it's going to look a lot like that. The key attributes, though, for a market structure bill are the definition of decentralization. Is it narrowly controlled? If it's narrowly controlled, that's not decentralized. We have a regime for that in the United States. It's under securities law. Good luck, right? Go try it out at the SEC. You don't need a new regime for that. If you're truly decentralized and you don't have a narrow group controlling, you need to have your own regulatory regime. That's already baked in. That's understood from all branches. Everybody's engaged in this. The second piece of this is the classification based off of the technology. What does this token do? We should regulate it based off of its functionality and its purpose. And those two things are baked into all these bills, Democratic, Republican, over the this Congress and the previous Congresses. So I think it's going to be baked in, and I think we'll get to a reasonable outcome, but with some drama to get a market structure bill, and that's going to take longer, perhaps July, maybe into the fall before that's resolved.
We only have a minute left, so this is going to be unfair, and I apologize in advance. But today we're seeing a massive market rally on the U.S. and China taking their tariff rates on each other lower after talks in Geneva over this past weekend. Was it the Trump administration that really is the one that blinked here?
It's unclear yet. And I think there's a rally in hope. Yeah. Hope is not reality, right? Hope is not, well, it is today, actually, but hope is not a set of policies, and it's not a tariff. We have to actually see the finer details of the outcome, and if this gets resolved soon in a permanent way, that is going to be long-term good for the United States and our trading partners, and the longer it takes, we're just extending pain.
All right, well, we have a 90-day window to start. We'll see where we are by August. Bloomberg contributor and former House Financial Services Chair Patrick McHenry, thank you so much for joining us. And just on that market action, it really is quite a rally we're seeing today, Mike. Up more than 3% on the S&P 500, nearly four full percentage points on the NASDAQ 100, well above the levels we were pre-liberation.
Yeah, tech is really leading the way on this. And of course, they had led the way down in the wake of April 2nd, Liberation Day.
All right, well, we're going to have much more on this in the late edition of Balance of Power, so we'll see you then at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. In the meantime, Bloomberg Business Week Daily is right ahead here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. You can get it on Apple, Spotify, anywhere else you get your podcasts. Watch us on YouTube, and of course, listen anytime on Bloomberg.com.